Political crisis of the 1790s. The French Revolution divides America. Americans disagreed over the ideologies of the French Revolution. Many supported the Jacobin ideas of social, egalitarian society. You should probably look up what egalitarian means. Americans with strong Christian beliefs disliked the Jacobins because they'd closed the churches in France, and many Americans feared a social rebellion in the U.S. Some Americans were also appalled at the Revolution's bloodshed. Dr. Guillotine developed his new technology in 1789 as a more humane form of execution. During the Revolution, more than 40,000 people were executed, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. During the same time, Pennsylvania farmers mounted the Whiskey Rebellion to protest Hamilton's excise tax on alcohol. 1,200 pounds of wheat, oats, or rye could easily be distilled into 20 gallons of spirits weighing 160 pounds. The liquor could then be loaded in jugs, slung across the backs of mules, and hauled some 300 miles from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. There it would be sold at the price of $1 per gallon. Much easier than shipping wheat, oats, and rye individually because they were heavier and would often rot or mold before they reached their destination. Whiskey had no expiration date. This could lead to the social rebellion that so many Americans feared. Good old John Jay, probably a smart guy but not a good negotiator, Jay was tasked with negotiating a treaty to put a stop to the British seizing American ships and impressing the sailors. In the end, the treaty acknowledged the right of Britain to stop neutral ships. American ships could then make a claim to the British government for illegal seizures. However, the British were not required to do anything about the claim. The treaty did require that the British remove their troops and Indian agents from the Northwest Territory, where they were hovering, waiting for the U.S. to pay off its debts. The treaty was seen as being very pro-British, which did not put the Federalists in a very good light. On the island of Saint-Domingue, a French plantation colony in the West Indies, a group of elite whites rule over a slave population of 500,000. The French Revolution intensified an already stressful situation and inspired a massive slave uprising. Toussaint Louverture seized control of the country and in 1803 proclaimed the independent nation of Haiti, the very first Black republic. Haitian refugees fled to the United States, causing American slaveholders to fear a slave revolt as revolutionary ideas spread to the South. Now let's talk about the rise of political parties. Most Americans believed political parties and/or factions were dangerous because they believed they did not serve the public interest. Federalist 10 and Brutus No. 1 both spoke to the problems of factions and the possible good. Hamilton's financial plan caused a great deal of debate and led to further divide among politicians. Both groups, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, were holding public festivals and parades to celebrate their candidates and their ideologies. In 1798, the Federalists passed the Naturalization, Alien, and Sedition Acts. The Federalists did not like the public criticism received on many of their policies. They knew they were losing ground or popularity, and they needed to hush their critics. To do that, they passed several acts limiting individual rights. The first one, the Naturalization Act, lengthened residency requirement for American citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. The second one, the Alien Act, authorized deportation of foreigners. And the third part, the Sedition Acts, prohibited publication of insults or attacks on the President or members of Congress. Keep in mind, this is prior to judicial review, so there was no option to fight these acts on the basis of the First Amendment. Federalist prosecutors arrested and jailed many Republican newspaper editors and politicians. The Alien and Sedition Acts led to the first constitutional crisis, as Virginia and Kentucky both wrote resolutions declaring the acts null or void. This sets a precedent for the idea of states' rights interpretation of the Constitution. Basically, the states have the right to judge the legitimacy of national laws. So this leads to the Revolution of 1800. The Revolution of 1800, also known as the Bloodless Revolution, was unprecedented. The Federalists had been in power since 1883, but now we see that the Anti-Federalists, or the now Democratic Republicans, gain control of the government, both the executive and legislative branches. Not unlike today, the election of 1800 was a very intense partisan contest. While there is still no campaigning as we know it today, both sides are working to win the election. The Federalists attacked Jefferson as an irresponsible radical, and of course the Democratic Republicans strongly disagreed with most of the Federalists' policies. The majority of electors cast ballots for Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Because of the tie, the election then went to the House of Representatives, based on the Constitution. It took several votes, and it wasn't until Hamilton declared his support for Jefferson that the House finally decided Jefferson as the new president. It is this bloodless change of power that showed the popularly elected government could be changed in an orderly way, even in times of bitter partisan conflict. Consider the election of 2016 and even the most recent Early on in the Republic, the U.S. has to deal with the issue of Native Americans and their highly coveted lands. Tensions mounted as settlers moved westward across the Appalachians and into the Ohio Valley. The government determined that the land was American territory as they looked upon the Native Americans as conquered peoples. Remember, they were left out of the Treaty of Paris and received no recognition for any assistance during the Revolution. The Native Americans, on the other hand, claimed that because they had not signed the Treaty of Paris, they were not conquered. The Native Americans banded together to form the Northwest Confederacy under Chief Little Turtle. They won several bloody battles, and most Americans believed the British were supplying them with weapons and encouraging them to attack the settlers. In 1794, the Confederation of Tribes was defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and the chiefs agreed to the Treaty of Greenville, which surrendered lands in the Ohio Territory and promised to allow settlement. By 1805, Ohio was a new state with more than 100,000 inhabitants. In an effort to work with the native tribes, the U.S. government encouraged the Indians to assimilate into white culture, taking on Western clothing, religion, speech. Many Native Americans converted to Christianity, but still retained their cultural heritage. Under Southern migration, many Americans decided to stretch their wings and discover what the new country had to offer. In an effort to find affordable land, most white tenants and yeoman farmers headed into Kentucky and Tennessee, and eventually they would move into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. At the same time, another group of migrants traveled from the Carolinas to the Gulf Coast region of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana to plant cotton. Recall, please, the ideology of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything. In the new republic, parents now wanted to provide land for all their sons, causing them to seek land further west. The lands of the original colonies were shrinking, and in order to find land for their children, many New England farmers left the area for affordable land in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and New York, not really the West we think of today. In the North, new techniques in farming improved the standard of living. Farmers switch crops from grain to potatoes. They buy farm equipment and transition to year-round farming schedules. They worked harder and longer and produced more than ever before. The map on this page displays the movement westward of settlers and the shrinking Native American lands. The Public Land Act of 1796 established the procedure for dividing and selling federal lands at reasonable prices, thus encouraging more and more people to move west, pushing the Native Americans off of their tribal lands. Thomas Jefferson was the first of three presidents that would be the Virginia dynasty, a group of elite men that were elected to the presidency from 1800 to 1825. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. All strongly supported westward expansion. Westward expansion, though, was highly contentious, as many believed that the country was too big and there was no way the government could protect the citizens. Others disagreed with the removal of Native Americans from their tribal lands. Jefferson began his time in office arguing with the Supreme Court and trying to assert his power as president. As Adams was leaving office in 1800, he appointed several last-minute Federalist judges. Jefferson ordered then Secretary of State James Madison not to deliver their commissions as judges. These are known as the midnight appointees. One of those judges, William Marbury, sued for his commission. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1803. While John Marshall, the Chief Justice, ruled that Marbury had a right to his appointment under the Judiciary Act of 1789, he ruled that the act itself gave the court more power than the Constitution allowed for. This ruling the law unconstitutional, and Marbury would not receive his commission. The facts of the case are less important than the precedent set by the John Marshall ruling, that a law set by Congress could be unconstitutional in establishing the doctrine of judicial review. From this time forward, the Supreme Court would exercise its power to decide if an act of Congress or the President was allowed by the Constitution. The Supreme Court could know over all the actions of the other two branches. Think back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. How do you think the Marshall Court would have ruled on those laws? All right, the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson was all about westward expansion and not a friend to the Native Americans. He wanted settlers to have access to land and rivers to transport goods, and he wanted to force the Indian population further and further west. It's a win-win for him. In 1802, the Spanish are in control of New Orleans, a major port bringing goods in from Europe and exporting goods from America down the Mississippi River. Spain decides to close the port to the Americans and revoke the right of deposit, which was duty-free transport up the Mississippi, that was granted by Pinckney's Treaty in 1795. Jefferson feared that a foreign power in control of New Orleans would eventually lead to European entanglements. George Washington spoke out strongly against involvement in foreign affairs in his farewell address. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte secretly forced Spain to cede the Louisiana Territory back to France as he hoped to restore the French Empire in the Americas. Luckily, Bonaparte got bored with the idea and busy with other problems and agreed to sell the territory to Jefferson for $15 million. This brings on a constitutional crisis, in a sense. Remember, Jefferson is a believer in strict interpretation of the Constitution, and nothing in the Constitution stated that a president could buy foreign land. He had argued with Hamilton over the National Bank because the Constitution did not provide for such a thing. Jefferson put his own spin on the purchase, though, and submitted the purchase to Congress as the president's right to make treaties. It took no time for the Republican Party to ratify the purchase. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States. All those acres convinced Jefferson that his agrarian society of independent farmers would happen. It strengthened his popularity and showed the Federalists to be a weak, sectionalist party. Aaron Burr, the Federalist vice president, was not going to take this sitting down. He heartily supported a group from New England pushing to secede from the Union. Hamilton accused Burr of conspiring to destroy the Union. Burr was furious that his reputation had been impugned and challenged Hamilton to a duel. Hamilton dies as a result of the duel, and Burr's future in politics is destroyed. Burr was eventually acquitted of treason. He was charged with murder in the state of New York, but he fled back to Washington to finish his term as vice president, thus making him immune from prosecution. Even before the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson had persuaded Congress to fund an expedition to explore the Western territories. In 1804, Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark headed for St. Louis. From there, they crossed the Rockies and eventually reached the Oregon coast, where they simply turned around and came back to Washington in 1806. The expedition was significant because it provided greater geographic and scientific knowledge of the region. It made U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory now. U.S. settlers were moving in. Better relations with American Indians and more accurate maps and land routes for fur traders and future settlers. Jefferson had a plethora of problems to deal with when it came to foreign affairs. Following Washington's advice, he sought to maintain U.S. neutrality despite provocation from France and Britain. The first problem Jefferson faced was not with another country, but with the Barbary pirates on the North African coast. Both Washington and Adams had paid tribute to the pirates to keep U.S. merchant ships from being seized. Jefferson refused to pay and instead sent a small fleet into the Mediterranean. The sporadic fighting lasted for 4 years, between 1801 and 1805, with no decisive victories. However, the U.S. did gain some respect, and the Navy offered protection to U.S. vessels trading in the Mediterranean. The second issue concerned U.S. neutrality during the Napoleonic Wars. Both Britain and France had a policy of seizing neutral ships and confiscating cargoes. From the U.S. point of view, Britain was the greatest offender, as they would also capture U.S. sailors, claiming they were British citizens, and impress them into service with the British Navy. Many Americans demanded war, but Jefferson followed a policy of diplomacy and economic pressures. The Embargo Act of 1807 was one economic pressure applied by Jefferson. The act prohibited the United States merchant ships from sailing to any foreign ports. Jefferson hoped that because Britain was the U.S. greatest trading partner, this would have a huge impact on their economy. The plan failed and actually caused greater economic damage to the United States. Britain simply turned to South American ports for the goods that they needed, leaving the U.S. Merchant Marine and New England shipbuilders economically devastated. The embargo caused a severe depression, causing New England to once again threaten secession from the Union. Jefferson repealed the act in 1809, allowing U.S. ships to trade everywhere but Britain and France under the now Non-Intercourse Act. Just as Washington had, Jefferson retired after his second term in office, despite the fact that there were no problems with freedom of the seas and trade between Great Britain and France, along with many pressures in the West from the Native Americans, had brought a group of young Democratic Republicans in Congress into the spotlight. These men from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio were known as war hawks because of their eagerness for war with Britain. As Americans moved west, for the longing of lands of British Canada and Spanish Florida grew stronger. In an effort to slow Western settlers, Tecumseh and Prophet, his brother, sought to unite tribes east of the Mississippi. Tecumseh was eventually defeated at the Battle of Tippecanoe by General William Henry Harrison in 1811. Most Americans blamed the British for stirring up trouble and providing the Indians with weapons, encouraging them to attack Americans. Falling to pressure from the West and the war hawks in Congress, Madison calls for a declaration of war in 1812. Americans are divided in their support for the war. Those who opposed the war called it Mr. Madison's War. The most outspoken were New England merchants, Federalist politicians, and Quids, or the old Democratic Republicans. By this time, New Englanders are making large profits off the European wars, and religious ties made many Americans more sympathetic to the Protestant Britain than to Catholic France. Federalists viewed the war as a Democratic-Republican scheme to gain more territory with the aim of gaining Democratic-Republican voting strength. This will be an ongoing theme as more and more land is added to the United States. The Quids criticized the war as going against classic Democratic-Republican ideas of limited federal power. The War of 1812 is known for several naval battles, with the U.S. defeating the British. The U.S. Constitution, or the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironsides, defeated the British ship off the coast of Nova Scotia and sunk it. One of the most important battles took place on Lake Erie in 1813, with Captain Oliver Hazard Perry stating, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." In the summer of 1814, the British Army marched through the nation's capital and set fire to the White House, the Capitol building, and other government buildings. It was during the British attempt to take Fort McHenry in Baltimore that Francis Scott Key penned the famous Star-Spangled Banner. In the South, General Andrew Jackson is celebrating several victories. In 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Jackson defeated the Creek Nation, virtually eliminating the Indians and opening more land for settlement. Jackson, along with free blacks and Creoles, defeated the British in their effort to control the Mississippi River in the Battle of New Orleans. The famous battle was meaningless as it was fought 2 weeks after the treaty ending the war had been signed in Belgium. The treaty halted fighting, returned all conquered territory to the pre-war claimant, and recognized the pre-war boundaries between Canada and the United States. Basically, the war ended in a stalemate, with neither side gaining anything. Prior to the end of the war, the New England states again threatened to secede. Radical Federalists called for a constitutional amendment, and as a last resort, then they would secede. The Hartford Convention saw delegates gather to consider the problems at hand. Secession failed, but a vote was held to require a two-thirds vote of both houses for any future declaration of war. Once the war ended and the treaty was ratified, the convention merely served to further identify the Federalists as weak and unpatriotic.